series discussing the past and present of analog photography. From the very first photos ever made to your hipster friend who buys a camera at every Goodwill he visits, this show will take you through it all. So dig out your grandma's camera from the attic and grab a chemistry textbook because we're diving into the developer and telling the great story of photography. I'm your host, Elliot Payne, and this episode starts us off with the invention of photography itself, the very first drawings truly made with light. But before we get into photosensitive paper and chemicals, we have to start in a very dark room, the very first camera. I'm joined today by Forrest Bourke, a Seattle-based photographer who's been working with the medium of film since 2014. I'm starting off this conversation with the story of the very first invention of the camera. What can you tell us about that, Forrest?
Yeah, hey, Elliot, thanks for having me on. So the first camera, which we probably wouldn't really identify as a camera today, is called a camera obscura, which is kind of a phenomenon that occurs when you have, like you said, a dark room and you put a hole in the wall. So if you have a hole in the wall of a dark room, you'll see an image on the opposite wall of the hole. And people knew about this phenomenon, since ancient times. It wasn't new.
Yeah.
But nobody really had any way to record that image. So you could make an image, but you can't make a photograph. You could make a drawing. You could make a camera obscura, and then you put a paper on the wall, and then you could draw it, but you couldn't record actually the light.
Yeah, and so this is sort of, like people would just do this kind of for fun? Was there a function to it, or more or less a thing people knew about?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what all uses occurred. I believe people watched solar eclipses through camera obscuras, which is actually still done today. People, for watching partial eclipses will poke a hole in a piece of paper and project the eclipse on the ground, which is kind of a very simple camera obscura.
That is interesting that sort of that technology is still sort of used to this day, or rudimentary technology. So obviously, an image on a wall is it's not a photograph as we would normally think of it. It's not what we usually think of with photographs. So how do we get from a camera obscura to the actual process of making images?
Yeah, so the critical thing that you need to do that is some sort of light-sensitive chemical. And there's a variety of chemicals that are light-sensitive, but most processes use silver or a salt of silver, and those are still used today. So kind of the root of using silver as a sensitive material traces back from the earliest days of photography and people making images all the way to the film that people shoot today.
So essentially, like, the image projection is more or less easy enough to accomplish, but how do you get that image to stay there and be used?
Yeah, exactly. And in the beginning, people found light-sensitive materials, but they had no way to preserve the image. So when you make an image using silver nitrate, which is the silver chemical that's sensitive to light, you can make an image and you can see it, but then as it is exposed to light more, the image goes away eventually. So that was kind of a technical challenge that needed to be overcome to be able to produce photographs that were more than a novelty that you could look at for a day.
Mm-hmm. Like example of that, I have some photosensitive paper that I got from like a box from my high school's art closet. It's some Ilford paper, and I figured out how to like project light onto it in my bathroom, and then tried to like dip it in the chemicals. But like it has faded tremendously since I messed around with that, because like I always didn't really have a way, like it's photosensitive, but without the proper system of like fixing it and all of that, make sure the chemicals on the paper remain in their photosensitivity after a certain point, so that you can have a final image that doesn't change.
Yeah, so you just said fixing, which is where I was going. So that is the process where we remove the sensitivity to light. So you first take something like silver nitrate and expose it to light. That makes an image, and then the next step is fixing it or removing the unexposed silver nitrate. So there were a number, it's kind of the case in a lot of times in history where a bunch of independent people work on the same thing and go in the same direction at the same time. But a lot of folks will say that Louis Daguerre was the first person to develop a real photographic process, which is called the daguerreotype. And people still shoot these today. It's a little bit involved to be able to shoot something like this. But you coat a plate of metal that is black, and that's just a black paint, but you coat it into silver iodide, so another silver salt, and then you expose that to light, and then later you fix it like regular table salt is how it's fixed. And then you have an image that you can see, and it's permanent. It's a little fragile because there's this silver image that is just on the surface of a plate of metal, so it's easily scratched or damaged. But it's permanent. You can frame it, and you can put it in a locket, and you can do all sorts of things. So that was kind of the earliest photographic process, or commonly credited as the earliest. So the disadvantage of the daguerreotype and any metal plate processes is that you only get one. So you take an image, you expose it. The metal plate in the camera is also the metal plate that is your photograph. So you get one copy. It's very expensive because you have to pay a photographer who's a incredible specialist in this new field. And of course they have the chemicals and the materials in the camera in the studio. It's also mirrored because the way optics and a camera obscura and any lens works is that the image that is projected is a mirror of the real world. So that's not a huge deal for most things, but it is, kind of a little odd that you have these photographs that are only mirrored. So kind of the next step was to do the same thing but on glass, so that you would have a glass negative, and then from that glass negative you can make prints. So once you have a glass negative, you can make a piece of photosensitive paper, again using the same silver nitrate, and you can expose that glass negative onto a paper, and then you get a positive, and you can make as many of those as you want. So that was kind of a big development in that you could make a whole bunch of prints. Obviously it's not cheap, but it's possible to make.
And so essentially, like, what was done there is, like, we know how to make an image. We know how to create usually a negative that you can project in, or you can show it in a certain way to make it look like a positive. But what was discovered there is that you could just do the process and then do it yet like one more time, but instead of projecting onto more glass, you project onto a piece of paper that has this photosensitive chemicals on it, so that you can then at last have a final image that you can make many, many more copies of using that same glass negative, which is also still relatively available, like glass plate photography.
Yeah, the thing, all these historical processes, people still do them. Some of course more than others, but because none of these require really anything super crazy. Like you can get the chemicals. It's not like they require a lab to manufacture all this. People are making this stuff in their home. So that's actually kind of a little bit of a tangent, but this kind of gives some hope to the future of analog photography, in that it's possible to make these early processes yourself, and that you don't necessarily need, if Kodak goes bankrupt again for the third time or whatever, you can still make your own. And it won't be the same, it won't be the same as going out to Kodak and buying Portra 400, but you will be able to make an image using chemicals and a camera that you can make all that yourself.
This reminds me of the guy that runs the Polaroid Preservation Project said something to the effect of the fact that although we can recreate a lot of the processes from the 19th century, a lot of those early processes with the daguerreotype and glass plate, wet plate photography, that kind of stuff, we can continue to do. But a lot of what we may lose and are losing is a lot of the 20th century, particularly mid to late 20th century technology, like color photography, things like instant film. But that is for probably another discussion. It is interesting that, the future of photography might be rudimentary, but, the beginning of photography was rudimentary. So there is a future for us. So what can we say about the state of photography at this time? It wasn't particularly an everyday thing. Like you said, it would be an expensive process with a mirrored image, and eventually you get to glass plate, which sped it up a little, or at least, it made it a little bit nicer quality, but it was still not a quick, snap a photo kind of process. How did we get to that?
Yeah, so I think the first really consumer camera, or really the like seminal consumer camera, would be the Kodak Brownie. So that was released around the turn of the 20th century and used roll film, which we would recognize today. They put a whole bunch of film in a roll, and I believe the earliest Brownies, you returned the whole camera to Kodak. But either way, they filled the camera up with film, and the price of the camera was cheap enough that a normal person could buy them. And they may even have been a loss leader in that they sold the camera at a loss and made it up on the film and processing, which was kind of Kodak's business model for all of the 20th century, was to anything that gets people to shoot film is a good product for Kodak. But the first Brownies were very simple. It just looks like a box with a hole in one side, which I guess is all any camera is. But that kind of led to the like real mass consumer adoption of this film, and people were able to take photos, and the Brownie was cheap enough that almost anybody could afford one.
And like at the time, like we think of now as the occupation that we call photographer is someone who doesn't just take pictures, but takes very good pictures worth enough that you can pay them for it. But at the time, a photographer was like a painter, and even more so that like you are the one person that can take photos. Like you have the skills necessary and the materials to be the person that takes the photos of anything that needs a photo taken of. And this was for the first time putting photography in the hands of everybody,
anybody,
an average person that just buys. You would like to make a family picture or take a picture at the park. Bring the Brownie, bring the Kodak, as I think they sometimes would call them.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of the beginning of the consumerization of photography, and it wasn't. I mean, it certainly was tremendously popular in the time, not as ubiquitous maybe as we have today with phones. It's not that every single person had a Brownie in their pocket, but it was enough that people were able to bring them around, and we have a lot more documentation of those times because people were able to shoot them on their consumer cameras.
So that's kind of the transition of, it's not like photography was invented and immediately consumerized. It was like invented, it assumed a role in society, and then eventually another role was added to it, which is a consumer, everyday person kind of mindset, which we could definitely say has changed the way that we even think about photos at all since then. So as far as Kodak's innovations, we've got roll film, we've got the Brownie. Is roll film, if I'm correct, that was Eastman himself created that or paid someone to create it. It wasn't pre-existing. He didn't commercialize something. He invented it himself.
Yeah, so like I said, the first Brownies were kind of a sealed system. So it was basically like a disposable camera almost. The first film that was in a Brownie was actually not film, it was paper. You shot it through the camera and then you gave it back to Kodak and they processed it and they gave you prints. And you can make contact prints from paper negatives, which I believe is how that first Brownie worked. Yeah, so it's kind of this closed loop where you bought the camera, shot the photos, gave it back, and then they gave you the prints back. And, they weren't large, these are only like 2-inch size prints, and they're not particularly high quality. If you enlarge them any larger, they wouldn't look very good, at least by our modern standards. If you're a consumer and you've never seen anything like this before, except in a studio by a professional, this is amazing.
Yeah, we were really excited to see the first, smartphone pictures, despite now the fact they look horrible.
Yeah.
So it's all about perspective, I say. And yeah, I guess that's sort of the catalyst for eventually other companies getting into that consumer market and even a different kind of professional market. But
yeah,
that's all the time we have today for history and photography. I'm going to first turn it over before we wrap up to Forrest. Where can we find you online? What is your socials and whatnot
Sure.
you want to share?
Yeah. I have an Instagram, which is forrest.bourke, and I also have a YouTube, which is just my name, Forrest Bourke.
All right. Thank you all for listening to Drawing with Light. My name is Elliot Payne. My Instagram and Flickr are both Elliot. That's ELLEOAT. Our logo is by Charlotte Payne, my sister, and the music is by Rev at emrev.bandcamp.com. Join us again soon as we continue the journey of the story of photography.